Let me now introduce our two conversationalists, both of them distinguished historians. Anthony Grafton is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History at Princeton. He's written extensively on the relationship between scholarship and science in the early modern period. His academic focus is on the cultural history of Renaissance Europe, encompassing architecture, the natural sciences, books, that's the writing and the making of same, astrology, antique codes of etiquette. Did I mention magic? How about forgery? Dr. Grafton took his bachelor's degree, his MA, and his PhD at the University of Chicago, and after studying at the University College London and teaching at Cornell, he settled in Princeton some 40-odd years ago. His many awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship, Andrew Mellon Foundation Award, and the Bolshoi Prize. He's a member of the American Philosophical Society and the British Academy. In 2011, he served as president of the American Historical Association. Ruth Scurr is an historian, a writer, and a literary critic. Her first book, Fatal Purity, Robespierre and the French Revolution, won a number of awards and was listed among the 100 best books of the decade by the Times. She reviews regularly for the TLS, for Telegraph, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. She was a judge on the Man Booker Prize panel in 2007 and the Samuel Johnson Prize panel in 2014. She took her undergraduate degree at Oxford and, like Dr. Grafton, moved east, in her case to Cambridge, where she took her PhD. She teaches history and politics at Cambridge, where she's a fellow of Gonville and Caius College. She is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Her most recent book, John Aubrey, My Own Life, was greeted with acclaim in Britain when it was published last year. No less a historian than Mary Beard recommended it as Book of the Year in Spectator. It topped the list of the Telegraph's best 100 books to ask for Christmas. As you may know from the glowing reviews it has recently received in the Washington Post and the New York Times, it has just come out in the United States, published by the New York Review of Books. What more need be said? Let me introduce Drs. Scurr and Grafton.
If you had to give the elevator speech about John Aubrey, if some publisher not as wonderful as the New York Review of Books Press, which is a fabulous institution, were asked, who is this John Aubrey? What would you say about him now?
I think I'd say that he is the most endearing figure of the 17th century, and I'd be borrowing that phrase from one of the reviews. And I would say he is attractive as a sort of everyman. He's not a genius. He's not the person who pushes forward the frontiers of scientific knowledge, but he is deeply engaged in trying to promote understanding at a time when the disciplines aren't separated out. So I see him as a pioneer, and a final thing I'd say is that he has a very unusual sense of historical time. He knew that what he was doing was talking to the future, and he's gathering up those materials, the anecdotes, the stories, being a witness to his times, so that he can deposit that in a form in which posterity, i.e. us, is going to be grateful.
That's wonderful. Can you say a little more about Aubrey and time? And one of the things it's very hard to put this man into into any box, but one box people sometimes put him in is that of an antiquary.
Yes.
And could you say a little about that, about Aubrey and the way he thinks of the past?
I think that's the key to all the different enthusiasms he has. So what Aubrey says about antiquaries is that they are born, they're not made. That into every generation, just as there are some very talented poets, there are some people with that special talent for treasuring the past. And not just the public past or the grand narratives, but the details, the small pieces of the past which would be forgotten if somebody with those particular talents didn't devote themselves to treasuring it. So he thinks his calling, a sort of vocational calling, begun when he was a child. He was the kind of little boy who loved to hear his grandparents' stories. He wanted to know what they remembered. He wanted to understand the world that was within their living memory, but might be about to vanish. And then when he went to Oxford, which he did as an undergraduate, he encounters an intellectual way of understanding those deep passions. And that becomes a very much more shared project. He meets other people there who are interested in that. And then there is the trauma of the Civil War. So while Aubrey's in Oxford, the war breaks out. His father wants to call him home. He says it's way too dangerous for you to be in Oxford. And so Aubrey, who's just got to this place of learning and just started to make the kinds of friendships where we can share the passion and the love of books and knowledge, is pulled back from that into the countryside. He does go back and he does maintain those friendships right the way throughout the rest of his life and into the next period of history.
Could you say a little more about what might have made Aubrey so passionate about the past? Why? And he's by no means, as you say, he's by no means the only one. This is almost an obsession for a generation of scholarly Englishmen. So what is there that makes the past so urgent? This is the age of the new science. We'll talk about the Royal Society. So why is Aubrey, who knows Hooke and doesn't like Newton and knows everything, why is he so passionate about medieval windows?
Well, I think we can give two kinds of explanation for that. So we can give the generational explanation. We can say, look, this is the generation who have the job of the restoration. They have to recover from the Civil War, and they also have new kinds of freedom to apply the pursuits of empirical knowledge. They're very excited about that. They're pushing forward those frontiers. So all of the disruption that there has been has almost provided an opportunity to do things like founding the Royal Society, etc. But we can also give a more personal and imaginative explanation, and we can say, well, Aubrey was the kind of little boy who was really distressed to go to school and find the textbooks were being covered in old pages of manuscript parchment. And he could see those beautiful illuminations, the illustrated letters, the fragments, and he thought, why are they being treated as waste paper? And he goes with his father to buy gloves, and the gloves are wrapped up in manuscript, and he's like, what's that about? And then there's the breweries where they're making beer, and one discovered, a great way to stop up the bottle is to use manuscript. And Aubrey's really personally distressed by that. So I think you can take the two. You can take the generational and the larger, wider picture, but also there has to be that personal connection.
He has wonderful ways of talking about manuscripts disappearing, which is one of the themes that comes back over and over. They fly away like butterflies. People are using them to line pie tins. He's just over and over again. His sense of loss is so pervasive.
And also his understanding that, I think lots of us who love books have this fear that, what happens to the library of a learned man when he dies? What happens to his papers? And Aubrey has this great fear. Often he will go and he will say, you must leave your books to a library. Or have you taken care that your papers are going to be in a safe place? And he worries about that for himself as well. These collections of paper and record and illustrations that he's making, how will he be sure that they are going to survive?
Yeah, that's just, it's fascinating to watch this. I'd be inclined to think that there's almost a connection with Hilary Mantel, and in a way it's Thomas Cromwell's destruction of the monasteries is behind much of this sense.
Well, Aubrey actually is very aware. He's born into the county of Wiltshire, and he says actually we had more monasteries and libraries in this county than in many others. And during the dissolution of those monasteries, in that generation, they were broken open and they're still unsettled. There's still that sense of as you said, the flying around like butterflies, and Aubrey wants to net them. He wants to net them and put them somewhere safe.
That's wonderful. Can you say a little bit about what an antiquary does? I mean, what kind of history did Aubrey do?
So the way he describes it to himself is he is the person who collects up the splinters of wood after a shipwreck. So time is a shipwreck. And then there are these fragments, and they could be in the form of stories, they could be objects, they could be paintings, they're rarities, they're things that he thinks are precious evidence about the past, and they need to be collected up. And so actually he applies that collecting model to a wide range of different interests. So he has a collection for the county of Wiltshire. He collects up details of the buildings, the plants, the history of the windows within the buildings, the stories of the families within there. But he also has a collection of handwriting. Aubrey is one of the very first people to figure out that you can date a manuscript by looking at the style of the handwriting, just as he's one of the first people to figure out that you can date a building by looking at the style of the window. Now, the biographical interests that he has are really an extension of that kind of antiquarian interest, and he wants to put into his biographies those tiny details that would otherwise get lost. So he uses the same antiquarian model when he starts to try his hand, as he puts it, as a biographer.
And he's very interested, isn't he, in how his subjects look, what they wore, how they bore themselves.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he's a very visual person. That's one of the reasons he is so vivid, and his prose is like almost like looking back in time, because he will tell you what people looked like, what they wore. He even does a kind of collection of the history of shoes as well. I mean, that's just one of his many, many sidelines. But he'll describe people's hair, you know, these brilliant descriptions of them having a moist curl is one of them, like he says, of Harrington. So that sense that he's also, his visual talents extend to being a very fine draftsman, and his manuscripts are full of beautiful drawings of landscape, but also sometimes of a Roman pot that he's found.
So this is a time in which being a learned man requires more than reading skills. You've got to be able to look, you've got to be able to draw. There's a real change in the nature of what learning itself is.
That's right. I mean, the looking is really crucial, and I'll give you an example. Aubrey, born in Wiltshire, grew up near Stonehenge. So he knew those stones very well from childhood. And he got involved in the debate, how old is Stonehenge? And Inigo Jones, obviously much more successful worldly than Aubrey, is sure that it's Roman, absolutely sure it's Roman. And William Charlton, who's also a member of the Royal Society and very, very respected and much more secure in his social standing than Aubrey, says, no, it's Danish. And not only that, the Danes use this to make their government decisions, and they stood on top of the stones to cast their votes. And in the margin, Aubrey writes, well, they must have been mighty sober if they stood on those stones. Very, very normal. And then he goes on to say, these guys are manipulating the evidence. They have a theory, but they're not looking at the evidence. And if you look at the evidence, you can see it's not Roman, it's not Danish, it's as old as you could possibly imagine. And for him, that means Druid. Right? Well, we know it's not Druid. But the point here is that Aubrey, for using his eyes and not having a pre-standing theory that he's applying, manages to be more right than anyone else at that time.
And that also connects him to, Well, in part the same group, but in part another group of people who are very prominent in his London after the Great Fire and the Restoration, and this is the world of the Royal Society of London. So, that's really a world of people who look and make conjectures and make arguments. So how is is Aubrey also, is he something other than an antiquary? Could you say he's kind of a virtuoso or something like that?
He is. I mean, his interests don't just go to the past. He's not just looking backwards. He's not even just looking at the present. He is looking to the future. He's involving himself in the scientific exploration of the world and hoping to make discoveries that will change the future. So one example we were mentioning earlier, he's an undergraduate in Oxford during the Civil War. Charles I brings his court to Oxford, and his physician is William Harvey. And Aubrey sees Harvey doing the experiments on the eggs, trying to understand the genesis of life within eggs. And he gets involved also in trying some very early blood transfusion experiments. Because of Tony's great tie, we were discussing the chickens that that Aubrey was trying to move blood between. But that's an example. But there's something beyond his own quite amateur enthusiasm, which is that he is a very, very pioneering believer in a form of intellectual property. He thinks that the people who genuinely make the discoveries and have the ideas need to be given credit, and that all too often what happens is that the person who first has the idea for the new law of physics or new discovery for medicine or whatever it is, very quickly somebody else who's better connected, more worldly, steps in and they get the credit. And that was something Aubrey found really distressing. And a lot of the time in the brief lives, he is trying to really pin down the truth about who discovered what.
And this is just the moment at which scientists discover that what matters in science is not just being right, but being the first one who's right. That's the one who gets all the credit. So this is a hugely important idea of his. And he may be the first person really to push it as a sort of general idea as opposed to arguing over specific priority. Exactly,
yeah. I mean, the famous example he gets involved with is between Newton and Hooke, and who had the first understanding of those laws of gravity. Aubrey's convinced it was Hooke. He knew Hooke very well. He lived with him for periods of time. He helped him in some of his experiments. And he keeps on urging his contemporaries to listen to Hooke's claim, to actually have had some of those ideas credited to Newton first.
And one of the things that story illustrates, and something I'd love you to talk about, is the kind of friend Aubrey was. There can't be a word that recurs more often in your book than friend.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he manages to be friends with such a wide range of people of different political persuasion, religious persuasion, people who are very well connected, people who are impoverished, a whole range of people that Aubrey manages to befriend. And he's also, this is a very important thing, the future, subsequent generations were confused about the extent to which Aubrey was a gossip, right? Lots of people thought that what the brief lives were was a sort of repository of scandals. Who had an illegitimate child, who was cheating on their wife, etc., all this information. But actually, Aubrey never wanted to do any harm with that information. He thought that before it was published, if it was ever going to be published, the subjects of the biographies and himself should be rotten in the ground like meddlers. That's what he says. So it's not a question of causing trouble. If he's a bit like a journalist recording his time, he's definitely not a tabloid journalist. He's not a scandal mongerer. And this shows you the kind of friend he was insofar as people did tell him their stories. If you were Milton's widow, and you saw Aubrey coming up the garden path, and you knew this was a gossip and a scandal monger, you would not invite him into the house and give him your stories.
Yes, that sounds exactly right. And he does say he wants to tell the stories with the pudenda and all in.
Yeah.
But I think that's not gossip, that's art.
Yes.
This is before the age of the fig leaf.
Exactly. Yes, and so later in the 19th century, the editions of Aubrey that were published were very censored, because they considered then that actually some of this information he's providing isn't suitable for publication. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Aubrey, he wouldn't have been surprised, but it's what he was trying to avoid as well. He was trying to say, look, I'm going to put down these stories, and then the future can decide what they're going to make of them.
So he really has a sense that we're waiting.
I think so, yes. Yes.
A confident historian, and he was right. Aubrey spends a lot of time in London, and he tells us a lot in your book about life in London. What's his London like? How is it, say, like Pepys's London, or different?
So Aubrey's London is less secure than Pepys. Generally, Aubrey is less secure than Pepys. He's not a wealthy man. He's born into a gentrified family, but he also, at a certain point in his life, inherits his father's debts. I mean, he has to basically struggle to try and pay them off out of the bequest in the will. It's never possible. And over time, he loses everything and he becomes a bankrupt. He doesn't have a stable home of his own. He has to stay with friends. So Aubrey's London is a more itinerant London than Pepys or Evelyn. It's also a London that has been traumatized by the Great Fire. And for an antiquarian like Aubrey, the fire was riveting, because afterwards a whole layer of Roman remains and things of antiquarian interest were churned up by the destruction
Those
that there
bodies
was.
in Old St. Paul's.
Bodies and coffins and etc. I mean, there's sadness and tragedy as well, because St. Paul's was the area for the booksellers. St. Paul's was where Aubrey went to buy books. And when the fire happens, there's a huge destruction of the stock, and the transactions of the Royal Society that they had been very proudly producing ever since it was established are destroyed there. So, Aubrey's very aware that for all the discoveries and opportunities that the fire brings about, there's been terrible destruction as well. His friendship with Hooke is one of the people who gets involved in planning the rebuilding of London. So Aubrey's very connected to that. He loves the new coffee houses. He thinks this is brilliant. Instead of just having to talk to your relatives and a couple of other people you happen to know, you can go to these coffee houses and you can talk about the news. You can meet new people. So Aubrey's very networked into this new way of living and sharing of information.
Yeah, these great scientists who are huge figures sound exactly like my graduate students. They go out every night to a coffee shop and then they go to a bar.
Exactly, that's right. Yes.
So it's a very lively social scene.
Yeah.
And part of it is very male. I mean, there seems to be something developing. There are already clubs that meet in certain places. You can already see a little bit of what will become the pattern of male social life in London for centuries.
Yes. But we mustn't forget the women who are caught by Aubrey's wonderful attentiveness to stories and to what things look like. So in the brief lives, there are very few female lives. You have to be very beautiful or the mistress of a very important man before you make it in to the brief lives in your own right. But Aubrey's method of biographical collection means he always goes and collects stories from the women who have been involved in those male lives. He knows the women are hugely important. The women in his own life are very important. He has a very, I always think this is a very good sign, a very strong relationship with his mother. He loves his mother. He's a bit annoyed when she stops him going on the grand tour, and she often gets in the way of some of the more ambitious and dangerous things he'd like to do, but basically he loves his mother. And he says very explicitly that he doesn't disdain to learn from women, that he will go and find truth from asking women what they remember. And a very wonderful example is when he's writing the life of John Dee, Elizabeth's conjurer, alchemist, man of enormous importance and learning, whom Aubrey's generation are fascinated by. And Aubrey, he's a very early subject for Aubrey. He thinks he must get together all the information that there is about John Dee. And he goes back to try and find the grave, and the grave isn't marked, so he tracks down the old woman who's the daughter of the woman who nursed Dee in his last illness, and she gives him wonderful information about what Dee looked like, what he wore, what he was doing when he was grinding up the eggshells to do the alchemy that then Ben Jonson gets the idea to write his play. So Aubrey, and very imaginatively from our point of view, then she says, well, this is the grave. And Aubrey tells us that the children in the churchyard use that particular grave as their safe house when they're playing tag together. So you get this whole social world come back to life because Aubrey went and looked to see who he could find who still remembered what it was like when Dee was alive.
It's just wonderful the way you evoke him even collecting these memories. There's something so evanescent, and he's so interested. Now, Dee's an amazing character. This summer I met a student of mine who was doing research on a particular manuscript in Chetham's library in Manchester, and they put us to work in Dee's study. It was wonderful because we had very, very rare books, and they shut us in. They put up a sign saying, "Meeting in progress, don't disturb." And nobody watched while we spent a day with these very rare books. But in the same room, there was a burn mark on a table, which they explained to us was the burn mark the devil had left while visiting John Dee. Because Dee was a conjurer, he spoke to angels, he had a very mixed reputation. My student, who describes herself as the least Kabbalistic Jew in the world, I have a great picture of her looking very skeptically at this part. But this is something that's very striking. The Aubrey who is so modern, the historian who's interested in, I mean, the hottest thing in history right now is the history of material objects.
Yeah.
And Aubrey's already doing that in 1670. Aubrey is right up to date with the new science. He's interested in transfusion, injection, all the things that are right at the cutting edge of the world of natural inquiry, which is London in the 1660s and after. But isn't Aubrey also really interested in witchcraft, magic, astrology? Could you say a bit about that?
Yes, so Aubrey is one of the people in his generation who still thinks that astrology is a science and that it's going to be put on a more secure foundation as a result of these new empirical methods. He always collects the nativities of his subjects and he has them cast. He has his own consultations with astrologers. He's very interested in other people who are trying to establish a scientific foundation. Now, one response to that would be, well, this is terribly backward. You know, the 18th century, when they look at some of Aubrey's collections, think, well, who is this guy who's collecting all this hocus pocus stuff? And you know, why is he interested in dreams and sightings and astrology? But another way is to understand that actually learning has not been separated out at that point. And Aubrey tells us what people believe. He doesn't say it's true. he shows you what they think about astrology, the power that it still has in his generation, and he gets into disputes. I mean, some of his friends are telling him, "Look, forget it. You know, this is not something I'm interested in." Others, like for example Ashmole, who set up the museum in Oxford, he and Aubrey spend hours sort of transcribing these nativities and astrological information and symbols. As a biographer, I became quite fascinated by the way in which these astrological charts and castings are a form of biography themselves, actually. That they are a coded life. And so the fact that Aubrey, as a biographer interested in stories, etc., is also interested in those codes makes sense to me.
Well, that does really make a great deal of sense. And of course, there are other learned people around the Atlantic world who share those interests, and the Salem trial was not as isolated as we often like to think it was. So what sort of a writer is Aubrey in the end?
So this is a very interesting question. I personally find Aubrey directly encountered a completely charming and riveting writer. He has a fantastic turn of phrase, and he has a wonderful ear. He will write down the words, the strange words, or even sometimes you can almost hear the accents of the ways in which people think, the rhythms of the ways in which people speak. So that's part of the very wonderful journalist side of him. There's also the visual, which we mentioned. So his writing has those very vivid qualities that a contemporary writer who's very good at describing what they see has. Then there's his wonderful humanity, which underpins his writing. The fact that he doesn't judge. He provides these lives, he provides these stories. He's not going to tell you what to think or cast judgment on the subjects. But the final thing to say about him as a writer is that he doesn't see himself as a writer. He's so modest that when he writes his biography of his friend Thomas Hobbes, he asks other friends, is my style good enough? You know, is this going to be okay? He sees himself as a recorder, as a collector, and so he's not vain. He's not sort of looking at himself in the prose mirror and thinking, oh, that's a good sentence, you know, thing. Nor is he invested in the idea of publication. So he's not trying really to finish these projects. And that's another thing that future generations have misunderstood. I think, who is this chaotic guy who collects all these research notes and just publishes hardly anything, just this one mad book at the end of his life with a load of spells in it? You know, what's going on here? But actually, Aubrey doesn't aim to publish in that way. He's still circulating manuscripts, as many other people were. He has huge respect for printed books, but he also has his idea of his own work is in passing on the materials to others.
I think there's a way in which this huge personal archive, which is really what it is one of the things Aubrey does that has the most counterparts outside in other people's careers. The great French scholar Fabry de Peiresc, who kept this vast apparatus also of historical and scientific observation and autobiographical observation, which Peter Miller has written about in a great book recently, or Pepys, yeah. or indeed Boyle, who's a fantastic self-documenter. This seems to be something in the period that people are trying to write in a way that takes in a vast amount of experience and doesn't lend itself to an easy shaping or a genre.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right, but Aubrey can be very frustrating in contrast to some of those because he tells you so little about himself because he doesn't think he's very important, right? So although he leaves us this great kind of biographical collection through which we know other people, when it comes to himself, he says, well, look, here's a couple of scrappy pieces of paper about what happened in my life, and if you want, you can have those as an end page in, you know, some other book about somebody or something else, you know. And you think, well, thank you, Aubrey, you know, thanks. Couldn't you have given us a little bit more systematic information about yourself? But that, I think, speaks, you know, that was my problem, really, is, you know, how do you... so often in history, the people who get the big biographies are the people who have lived in a way that expects them. You know, they prepared for them, actually. There's the material, there's that sense of expectation, etc. Aubrey's a modest man. He's a self-effacing man. So how do you write a biography of him that keeps him at the centre, and you don't keep getting distracted by whatever great discovery Newton has just had, or, you know, Milton's latest offering?
You know, he calls himself the Whetstone, so
Yeah.
how do you write the biography of the Whetstone rather than the knife? And the answer is you've done it absolutely triumphantly. One last question from me, and I know you answer this in the book, but I'm sure the audience would like to know, how did you come to Aubrey?
So I knew the brief lives as a child. I lived in Wiltshire after I'd finished my time at Oxford. But I think the deep emotional connection for me was that I had worked on the French Revolution, a period of total destruction, bloodshed, darkness, and I was very attracted to the idea of working on a period of restoration, and Aubrey's mildness, his concern to preserve rather than destroy, was hugely, actually emotionally attractive to me, as almost a recovery from that other revolution. So it was eccentric to go back in time to a previous century and a different country, but I think that there is a deep connection there.
You mentioned something about the Salem witch trials,
Yeah.
and it sort of caught me off guard. So can you amplify that, what you were saying?
Well, you're not here to hear me, but very, very briefly, the Salem witch trials were attended and approved of by some of the most learned people in the colonies, who actually believed in witchcraft, believed in the intervention of spirits in the world, just as Aubrey did. They would have had wonderful conversations if they'd met. It's a prospect I'd like to imagine.
I mean, we don't know the extent to which Aubrey does believe in intervention in the spirit world. What we know is he tells us that people do tell those stories. So he'll say, you know, it is said that, you know, there was a fairy in the garden. He doesn't say there was, or he says, you know, it's a wonderful phrase, this is his phrase, you know, that there was a sprite and it disappeared with a most melodious twang, right? That's Aubrey. Did it? You know, he doesn't say, you know, and this proves the existence of the other world, but he records almost like a record of customs and beliefs, a sort of a history of folklore, actually.
Doesn't he somewhere say England has never been merry since the sprites were driven out?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
At times, he doesn't seem to like Protestantism very
Absolutely,
much.
yeah.
How, I mean, a terribly complicated religious, political time that he lived through. How did he negotiate through all of that complexity? How did he survive?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Why didn't he leave?
Well, so one answer is Aubrey's not very important. He's not holding high office. He's not very exposed. That said, he's close to people who are. He's very close to Thomas Hobbes, who, after all, is in exile in France. And Aubrey is the person, after the return of Charles II, who gets in touch with Hobbes and says, it's safe, come back now, I'll reintroduce you to the king. And Hobbes's ideas about keeping religion out of politics as much as you possibly can are hugely important to Aubrey. So the one thing he fears more than anything else is a return to religious strife, to a return to civil war. So he does have a deep response to how to survive. I mean, I'll give you another example, though, of the way in which he manages to be close across the political and the religious spectrum, quite astonishingly so. His family is basically royalist during the Civil War, but then under Cromwell and the Protectorate, he gets involved with Harrington and going to the coffee shops and listening to Harrington map out, you know, what the Commonwealth is going to look like, and these ideas about the Republic there. So he is able to combine those interests. After the Restoration, and after the establishment of the Ashmolean Museum, there was a movement to remove the portrait of Oliver Cromwell from it. And Aubrey said, no, you might hate Oliver Cromwell, but the future will want to see that portrait, so it's going to stay in the museum.
In the answer that you just finished, you said he was very worried about seeing a return to religious strife and civil war. Does that mean that he saw the Civil War primarily as a religious conflict?
That's certainly a part of it, absolutely, yes. I mean, it's not only that. He sees it as a political upheaval growing out of a religious conflict. But yes, he's very concerned about the settlement of the throne. He fears that Catholicism will cause further trouble in England. He's hugely relieved with the Glorious Revolution and William and Mary coming and things. So he lives through this period of enormous constitutional upheaval and uncertainty, and certainly religion for him. He's very hard to pin down. I mean, there's one time when Aubrey thinks, oh, you know, all I want is to be with my manuscripts and my books. Maybe I'll become a Jesuit, right? So he sticks this in a letter and posts it off to Oxford. And then he thinks, oh my God, what have I done? What if, this guy's papers get searched and there I am saying, oh, I think I might just become a Jesuit. So he says, please be sure that you burn that letter. If this is to his collaborator, Anthony Wood in Oxford, who is a Catholic. I think, actually, Wood is very likely to end up with his papers being searched, and there will be this pointlessly incriminating comment from Aubrey. But he's got Catholic with a small c tastes. He wants to actually know people right the way across those divides.
And just to those of us who come to this completely cold, what decade is he writing? And I'm not actually sure if he's 1640s or 1680s.
So he's born in 1626, and most of his writing is taking place after 1650, so 1660s, 70s, 80s. He dies in 97. And sometimes it's hard to know in this collection, he's a great sort of almost the inventor of cut and paste that we all do on our computer the whole time, but he's doing it physically. So he's cutting up his notebooks and rearranging them constantly and sticking them into different notebooks and things. And some of those notes go right back to the 1650s, and others, obviously the density of them would be 1680s.
Also, being a neophyte, you mentioned a couple of names, Newton and Harvey, and you've given a little bit more knowledge as far as the length of time of Aubrey. Can you put those two people in relation to the areas of interest that they were, talking about?
Newton and Harvey?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
So Harvey, as I mentioned, is the king's physician. He is a practicing doctor as well as someone who is a pioneer. So Charles I, yeah, that's when he comes to Oxford. But then Aubrey continues to know Harvey after the execution of Charles I. He knows him well into old age. He leaves us this wonderful portrait of Harvey as, drinking, one of the first people to embrace coffee drinking with his brother. That's very important to them. And how Harvey says, actually, you know what? After I discovered the circulation of the blood, my practice really declined. Everyone thought I was some kind of quack, So saying like people want a conventional doctor, right? You want the mainstream doctor. You don't necessarily want the genius doctor who's had an idea that nobody else has ever had. So Harvey's practice is, threatened by having made this great discovery. Aubrey writes that down. He collects a sample of Harvey's handwriting, and he says, and I remember seeing him going off to see his patients on his horse, and he even asks him on one occasion for a recipe to cure some minor illness of his. So there's a combination there of him being very interested in Harvey's work and very respectful of it, but also knowing what Harvey was like, you know, treasuring those details. Newton he knows less well. I mean, Newton is through the Royal Society. He's more remote. And really his interest there is through his friendship with Hooke, who's interested in similar scientific projects and sharing. And this whole group of Royal Society members are very exciting. Aubrey's one of the original founders of the Royal Society, and it's very, you know, constantly bringing projects to them. You know, he'll discover what he thinks is a new mineral spring, and he said, right, I'm going to send off a sample to the Royal Society and get that analysed.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your book tremendously. And I never read the introduction first, I always read it last.
Right.
And I was reading the introduction last night and came across one of the first comments, which is, throughout Aubrey's lifetime, the English were losing assuredness of their identity to a degree not to be repeated to the late 20th century.
Yeah.
And I wondered what you meant by that.
All the constitutional questions and upheavals that there are. So this question that, you know, Aubrey's writing at a time where the UK doesn't exist. Okay, it's not actually until a decade after his lifetime, 1707, that there is that proper union there, and now we're going through a period of challenge.
You're talking about Scottish independence, in fact.
There's that. Yes, yeah, and also if you from the Welsh perspective as well. So there's a movement there too.
Not quite the same.
Well, we're not yet.
Professor Scurr, you mentioned that Aubrey was encouraging people to take care of their own book collections. So how did he provide for his own work when he died?
So two things to say about that. Aubrey is a great collector of books all his life. He recognises their value, but he knows, he can't always take care of them. He's worried about them. He has this, you know, thinks of them sort of going mouldy in the countryside in Wiltshire. And B, he needs to sell them on occasions just to have money to live. So one of the things we have in Hooke's diary is Aubrey selling Hooke books to put into the Royal Society's library so that Aubrey has enough petty cash to get by on for that particular month. With the manuscripts, rather than the books, he recognises once Ashmole has told the University of Oxford, you're going to build me a museum and then you can have my collection of rarities. Ashmole, obviously a very worldly, much more instrumental figure than Aubrey. Aubrey thinks, actually that would be the best place for me to put my collections as well. And that's basically why we have what we have. They were put by Aubrey at the end of his life into the Ashmolean Museum and then transferred to the Bodleian, and there they are.
You mentioned that Aubrey had friendships that he kept alive for years and years, but he was also a somewhat litigious man. Always lawsuits, and that's part of the reason he was poor.
No, so there is a very damaging lawsuit, and that's not at Aubrey's instigation. That's the woman he attempts to get married to, which is, Aubrey thinks he's going to fix up his finances by making this good marriage. But unfortunately for Aubrey, he picks a woman who's already taken another man through the courts for breach of contract, and she does pretty much the same with him. And there's another, I mean, there are other lawsuits relating to some of the debts and inheritance issues that he had, but I don't think Aubrey's not causing this situation. He's not himself litigious. He really does want to get on with his work, actually, but other people are sometimes litigious towards him.
What did he do that got him the honor or whatever of having the Aubrey Holes named after him?
Oh, yes, right. That's very interesting. So I mentioned Stonehenge and how he'd grown up near Stonehenge and valued those stones and trying to work out how old they are. So one day he's out hunting with his friends and he comes upon Avebury. And then he stops, gets off the horse and thinks this is actually the cathedral to the parish church that is Stonehenge. He takes Charles II to see it, and Charles II says, great, I'd like a survey. You know, you do an account and a survey of these stones. So Aubrey also goes back to Stonehenge to do the survey there. And that's when he discovers some new holes. Now, there's a dispute among the archaeologists as to whether or not he discovered the holes that are called the Aubrey Holes, or if it was another set of holes that he actually discovered. And that's one of those differences in the record. But what is for sure is that Aubrey provides us with these really important visual and professional plans of what those monuments looked like in his time, and is instrumental in stopping the local people at Avebury breaking down the stones, because they're still using those stones to recycle them as building material for their new houses. And because Aubrey took the king there to try and preserve the monument, and then did the surveys afterwards, that was a help in stopping it happening.
Sir.
Since we're in Pennsylvania, I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit when Aubrey was thinking of coming to Pennsylvania.
Yes, his friendship with William Penn, absolutely. So Aubrey leaves us a wonderful life of Penn. He had connections to him through the Royal Society, but also through Penn's family connections to the area in Wiltshire where Aubrey himself grew up. So he becomes friends with Penn. When Penn is setting off, they say, right, we're going to correspond, we're going to stay in touch, because William Penn wants to know what's happening back at the Royal Society. He wants to hear the news of the experiments. He wants to stay in touch. So there are entries in my book based on the letters that Penn sends back to Aubrey, telling him about what's going on here, what he's doing. And then Penn says, well, look, why don't you come? You know, you can have this amount of land. I'd like you to fill it with French Protestants, and you come across, and you know we'll have a life here. Aubrey never goes, but what he does leave us instead is this very beautiful life about Penn's the sensitivity of William Penn as a child. The way when he was reading the Bible, he would be so moved to tears. He's sort of very, very imaginative portrait of this person. And again, Aubrey would have known that for all the other things that Penn did, those particular details about his early childhood, etc., would have been lost if Aubrey hadn't put them into his life.
Just to say, what's your favorite thing in Aubrey?
Which is my favorite manuscript?
No, your favorite piece of Aubrey's writing. If you were going to tell someone, here's the one page you should read that would really give you a sense of the charm, the brilliance, the observational powers.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very hard question to answer, but the one that meant an enormous amount to me was the beginnings of Aubrey's life of Hobbes and the letters he writes explaining, because the life of Hobbes is really the biographical project out of which the others take the shape that they do. And Aubrey gives us an explanation as to what he's doing, which I think I took as really the explanation of his whole life. And he says that matters of antiquity are like the light after dusk, that they're clear at first, but by and by, crepusculum, the twilight comes, and then total darkness. And when I read that, I knew immediately that I was going to move that to be the ending of my book. This sense of this very, very humane, very, very real sense of the passage of time and the way in which lives, as he puts it, in this in and out life, that we're such brief candles and that we go out so quickly.
Wonderful. So I hope you'll all join us upstairs for a book signing. But before that, let's thank Ruth Scurr for this wonderful description here.